Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannan. Like that old Journey song, More Than a Feeling, is God more than just a feeling? Now, you might think that this is an odd question to ask, but it's not, because many people equate God with a feeling of God's awareness or presence. And that is their primary reason for believing in God. It's a personal experience, essentially an emotional state that convinces them that God exists and is real. So, is God more than a feeling? And the answer is yes, definitely, God is more than a feeling. Primarily, God is the uncaused metaphysical cause of physical reality, who decides what to make real and what not to make real out of the infinite logical possibilities for physical reality. That is a metaphysical definition of God. And it's the correct definition of God, and it doesn't mention emotions or feelings once. God is the uncaused reality. God is the uncaused reality responsible for the creation of physical reality. God has an uncaused mind and an uncaused supreme intelligence and an uncaused knowledge of all logical possibilities for physical reality, as well as knowledge of all physical reality that has been created. And that is a much greater encompassing thing than just an emotion, just a feeling. Now, feelings are included in those logical possibilities for physical reality, whether they're just potential realities or they're actualized realities. But it's just a subset of the infinite number of logical possibilities for physical reality. God is so much more than just a feeling. God is the uncaused reality and responsible for the creation of all physical reality. So you should think of God in metaphysical terms. God as the creator is the correct answer. God is the uncaused metaphysical cause of physical reality. So I would stay away from ideas that God is a feeling. And your primary proof for the existence of God ought to be a metaphysical proof. And that's what the cosmological arguments for the existence of God provide. They provide metaphysical, philosophical, good grounds for believing in the existence of God. None of those arguments reference a feeling whatsoever. So, your primary understanding of God should be philosophical, metaphysical, an understanding that God is the uncaused reality, the creator of physical reality, not a feeling. Um, that being said, why do people talk about God as a feeling? Now, there's a famous statement in uh, the Gospel of John that God is love. Love is a feeling. That's an emotion. So, doesn't this seem to contradict what I just told you? That God is the uncaused metaphysical cause of physical reality? now you're saying God is an emotion. How does this make any sense at all to say God is love? Well, when someone speaks of God as being love, first of all, that's a Christian understanding of God. And second, that's a reference to God's nature. God has a loving nature. It is not an explanation, a metaphysical explanation of who God is. So don't get confused by that. So why even talk about this? God is love. Why are you associating an emotion with God? Why do that? And there's reason for that. The primary reason really isn't to prove God exists. Although some people feel that God's love in their life is their proof that God exists. But that's not really the primary proof for why God exists. The primary proof is the metaphysical philosophical arguments I gave you. So why are we even discussing emotion as it relates to God? And this really has to do with a completely different question than does God exist? How do you prove God exists? The question that the emotions involve is how do you communicate with God? How do you communicate with God? So the first thing is don't confuse the two questions. They're two separate questions. Does God exist? That's answered by the 22 cosmological arguments for the existence of God. It's answered by uh, metaphysical, philosophical arguments for God's existence. They don't reference emotions at all. And God is not an emotion. God is the uncaused reality. However, God has a nature, and the nature, according to Christianity, is loving. Now, that has to do with how do you communicate with God? Because some people basically say, well, if you can't communicate with God, how do you know he's there? How can you prove he's there if you can't communicate with him? So to them, the proof of God is based on the proof of being able to communicate with God. So that's the way a lot of people think. Now, that's incorrect. That's wrong. The primary proof for God is metaphysical philosophy. It doesn't require emotion. But some people, they want to see communication with God in order to believe in God. So that's when you get into this question of how do you communicate with God, and that's when you get into this question of emotion. Now, a lot of people feel that their personal experiences, their emotional states, prove, at least to them, that they're communicating with God. And in that sense, that is proof that God exists because they're communicating with a being, and you can't communicate with the being if the being doesn't exist. So to them, that's proof God exists. Um, that should never be your primary proof that God exists, but it is a proof to a lot of people. The problem with feelings are who knows why you're having the feelings? Maybe it is because God is communicating with you. Maybe it's you're just talking to yourself, or maybe you got a mental problem of some sort. Who knows? I mean, how do you prove that you're actually communicating with God, short of performing some sort of miracle to prove it? So, this sort of subjective personal experience proof of God is not really something that you can easily prove to other people. It's really a personal proof, a subjective proof, not an objective proof. But nonetheless, it's important because the question of, well, how do you communicate with God is a very important question. I mean, I can say to you, well, God exists, and metaphysically, this is why. Okay, but then how do you communicate with God? Why should it matter that God exists if he doesn't communicate with me? And that's a good question. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about communicating with God, but I want to make clear to you that God is clearly more than a feeling. When you're discussing feelings, you're discussing communicating with God, not really proofs for the existence of God himself. The first thing to understand is that God is omnipresent. This means that God's influence and control extends to every corner of the universe, every place that he has created. God has control over and sustains at every moment of time and of reality. So God is everywhere, essentially, what this means. And guess what? That also includes inside your brain, because your brain is part of the universe, is part of creation. So God is also in control and sustains your brain matter. So theoretically, because God is omnipresent, God can communicate with you directly in your brain, directly in your own thoughts and your own feelings. So theoretically, it is possible for God to communicate with you in your brain. The question is he? Is he communicating with you? When is he communicating with you? Is he communicating with other people? That's a tough question to answer, and it's very subjective. It's not something that's easily proven objectively speaking, because short of some sort of miracle, there's really no way you're going to prove to somebody else that God is definitely talking to you. Um, but nonetheless, theoretically, because of omnipresence, God has the ability to talk to you. And you could ask yourself, well, why wouldn't God talk to you? Right? God created the universe. He created you. Um, he has the ability to talk to you. He certainly has the intelligence to communicate with you. He has supreme intelligence. So why wouldn't he talk to you? Why wouldn't God talk to you? Um, he should. The probability is that he would. Otherwise, he's all alone in the universe. He's the only uncaused thing there is. It's kind of lonely. Why not talk to your creatures? Why did you make them to begin with? Not sure why you wouldn't talk to them. You probably would. So there's good reason to think God would communicate with people. And certainly God has the ability to do so. So this is completely plausible that God would in fact talk to somebody inside their own brain. Is he doing it for one particular person? Who knows? That's that's the $100,000 question. But it is theoretically possible. Um, you should understand that the emotion of love is a guidepost in Christianity for communicating with God. Now, love itself is an emotion, and God contains the concept of love. It's one of the infinite possibilities for physical reality. But God his mind includes all the infinite possibilities for physical reality, not just love. So God is clearly more than just love. However, Christians believe love is a method of communicating with God. And when you talk about communicating with God, it's a two-way street. You can speak to God, and God can speak to you. Sometimes it's said that you're only speaking to God, and sometimes God is speaking back to you. So communication is generally a two-way street. But anything you say to God, because it's in your brain, and God is omnipresent in your brain, God will hear that. God is aware of every square inch of the universe. So when you talk to God, God knows you're talking to God because God is omnipresent. He can't help but know that you're you're doing that. Um, Now, whether God's talking back to you or not, that's a different story. Who knows? It's very subjective. So when people speak of God being loving and God is love, they're really talking about a method of communication with God, a method of communing with God, as opposed to just a theoretical, philosophical understanding that God must be real. So, this idea, it's a Christian idea that God is love, um, and it has its roots in uh, Judaism. It essentially uses love as the signpost, the direction you follow in order to communicate with God. The idea is that God has a loving nature, and God has written that loving nature on every human being's heart and conscience. And therefore, every human being has the ability to find God because that understanding of God's loving nature is inherent in every human being, and they can follow the guideposts to communicating with God if they choose to follow it. Likewise, the idea of following the negative emotions like hate, can lead you to an evil supernatural being, such as Satan and his uh, devilish minions. But the idea is that the emotions are a path to communicating either with God or with the devil, essentially. Um, and that's what basically that's a core teaching of Christianity, that you need to be loving, act like a loving Jesus in order to communicate with God, in order to travel towards God and understand God. So when people talk about God is love, they're really talking about the signposts that you follow to find God, to communicate with God. They're not talking about the metaphysical definition of God. They're talking about finding God, communicating with God. And to them, that's what's most important. Because you can understand theoretically there's a God, but if you can't communicate with that God, what good is that God to you, really? So the importance of communicating with God can't be understated. And it really, to many people, overshadows the metaphysical understanding that God is a reality, albeit a very mysterious and uncaused reality. So people have come up with all sorts of traditional methods of communicating with God. And among those are prayer, where essentially you're speaking to God in your head. Some people have God speak back to them. Whether that's actually God speaking back or not, who knows? But a lot of people claim that. Other methods um, include speaking in tongues. That's where Someone is basically has the Holy Spirit full of them, and they speak in some sort of really incomprehensible vocal emissions, and then there's somebody else who interprets it. Oh, this is what the Spirit is saying through this person. So it's kind of like a trance with an interpreter of what is being said, what it means. Another traditional form of communication is fasting, meditation, isolation, uh, reading biblical texts can also be a form of communicating with God, because the biblical text is supposed to be the Word of God. God is talking to you in these texts. That's a form of communication with God. Pilgrimages, trances. Uh, some religions have drug-induced trances. That's how they communicate with God. There's singing. There's, of course, miracles can be a communication with God. You could say, God, if you're here, turn this water into wine, and then the water turns into wine. It's a miracle, but it's also a communication. Um, Now, I don't know anyone who's been able to do that except for Jesus, but it is technically a communication. There's interpretive dance is considered a communication with God. There's mysticism. There's simple coincidences. There's things that happen in life that seem too much to be a coincidence. It looks like it's the actual hand of God intervening in your life or in history or in the circumstances. It's too coincidental to be a coincidence. Maybe it's God who's doing it. There's communing with God. Jesus says, if two or more of you come together in my name, I'll be there. So there's this collective communing, which creates this ability to communicate with God. Acts of kindness can be a way of communicating with God. Again, it's the emotional and the act of being loving, like Jesus was loving, and that allows you to experience and communicate more fully with God. There's things like visions and apparitions and dreams and then actual appearances uh, by saints or angels or supernatural beings of all sorts. So there's all sorts of traditional methods of communicating with God. Now, again, I'm not saying that these things will work for you or that they're always legitimate and that there aren't uh, people who are delusional or who are just lying, because of course there are. So, but this is a very subjective area of belief. And a lot of people just base their belief that they're communicating with God on faith alone. They just choose to believe they are communicating with God. And they equate those personal experiences and feelings and they associate it with communicating with God. Who's to say they're wrong? God is capable of communicating with people directly in their brain. So who's to say? Maybe they're right. Maybe they are communicating. Maybe they're not. It's so subjective that it's really it's not something that's really objectively provable, short of a miracle. Now, your emotions pre-exist your knowledge of God. So when you're born, you have your entire emotional package. You may not have experienced all your emotions, but they're all there before you even knew God existed, at least in an intellectual sense. So uh, these emotional states pre-exist your knowledge of God. There's no need to know that God is real in order to experience these emotions. Now, these emotions could be God communicating with you, even though you have no knowledge of God. This is the idea that love is written on the human heart, that the conscious informs us of what God wants, even if we don't intellectually understand that God exists. And these emotions, since they pre-exist our knowledge of God, would be they're not dependent on knowing God exists. And yet God is still communicating with you. So that's a Christian understanding that God is love, uh, and and showing that loving conscious is something that God gives every human being in order to communicate with God, if they follow those guideposts to that communication, regardless of whether intellectually they understand God exists or not. You know, another question is, well, why would God's nature be loving, right? And the answer is, well, first off, because Jesus tells us God's nature is loving. And Jesus rose from the dead, and he was clearly a genius. And he's the best candidate for being an actual prophet of God, as well as God himself through the Trinity. So that's what he says. So if somebody rises from the dead, believe what they tell you. Nevertheless, objectively speaking, in a metaphysical sense, why wouldn't God's nature be loving? What's the opposite of love but evil? Hate. There's no reason why God would be evil or would hate. God has nothing to fear. There is no, if there's no fear in God, there's nothing to root evil into or hate. God is uncaused, which means nothing can destroy God. Even God can't destroy God. God has nothing to fear whatsoever. And God is in control of everything he creates, which means he can blink it out of existence anytime he wants. He has absolutely nothing to fear. So there's no reason for evil or hate to grow in God. There's no basis for it. There's no fear in God whatsoever. So, of course, God would be loving because there's no reason that he would be evil or hateful. There's no fear in God. So, of course, God would be loving. Um, so this Judeo-Christian understanding that God is love and that's how you communicate with God makes a lot of sense, especially in light of the fact that metaphysically speaking, God can't be evil. God has nothing to fear for evil to take root. So God would be loving. Creating us is in fact a loving act. Why did he create us? Well, he didn't have to. And of course, the idea that God would want to communicate with us makes perfect metaphysical sense because who else is God going to talk to? Is God just going to stay by himself all alone in the universe? Or is he going to talk to his creatures? Well, obviously, any rational being would speak to his creatures. So he's speaking to his creatures. He doesn't have an evil nature whatsoever. He has nothing to fear. He's created us. That's certainly loving. So why wouldn't God use love as a method of communicating with his creatures? It makes perfect metaphysical sense. Um, However, that is really a Christian understanding, an act of faith, and it's very subjective. It's not something really you can objectively prove, except for the philosophical arguments I just gave you. So, in conclusion, is God more than a feeling? Yes, absolutely. But feelings are important, especially the Christian understanding that God is loving. But God is definitely more than a feeling. So when you have atheists claim that God, you're basically equating God with love, and how can you just claim that love is proof of God? Understand that the primary proof for the existence of God are philosophical, metaphysical, cosmological arguments, and not just this idea that God is love and is an emotion. That's really a personal sort of proof, a subjective sort of proof, not a primary proof, and not the primary proof I would argue to an atheist. Um, this sort of personal experience proof that really is uh, that's the sort of proof that practicing religious people might offer to you as their reason for believing in God. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. It's just that the primary proof is philosophical, metaphysical arguments, not just the idea that God is love. All right. Well, I hope you learned something, and take care.